Good evening, and thank you for joining the LIDNUG user group for yet another presentation. Tonight's presentation will be done by Robin Shahan. She's Master MVP for Windows Azure, and we'll be looking at Azure for developers. A few housekeeping items before we kick off, and I hand over to Robin. I want to do a big thank you to our continued primary sponsors, Oxweb, Telerik, and PostSharp. Thank you very much for your ongoing and continued support of LIDNUG. Another event, we have Jeb Process or Precise doing the What's New in Windows Phone 7.1 Mango on August the 30th. A quick note is that we have postponed it by 2 hours. So it won't be the normal 10 a.m. PT time, but it'll be at 12 o'clock PT. Also, in September the 22nd, we have Scott Guthrie Unplugged, the 9th session coming up. So yeah, we have a fairly hectic time in the next couple of months. The October events will be shared in the next week and a half. Some things to also be aware of, if you're not a member of LIDNUG, go to linkedin.com/groups and use either the GID, the group ID of 43315, or simply just search for LIDNUG on LinkedIn and you'll find us. Our official website is www.lidnug.org. And this is also where you can find the recording from today's presentation. Our calendars in different formats, HTML, XML, and web. Also our events profile page on Eventbrite. It's lidnugevents.eventbrite.com. Of course on social media, twitter.com/lidnug, and on Facebook, facebook.com/lidnug. If you have any questions or suggestions or comments, feel free to email us at info@lidnug.org, and one of the helpful LIDNUG management team will get back to you. Also, just quickly putting out a call out for moderators. Feel free to put your hand up if you want to help us moderate our discussions on LinkedIn. So I'm going to hand over to Robin. Robin, thank you very much. She should be just about ready here.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Hello, Robin, and thank you for coming on board.
You're welcome. Good morning.
Good
my
morning.
name is Robin. Go ahead. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Robin Shahan. I'm Director of Engineering at a startup called Goldmail. We had a unique opportunity last year to migrate all of our infrastructure to Azure, which I did with the help of some of the other developers, and pretty much everybody in Ops and Engineering chipped in to make it work. We did it in under 2 months. It was a turbo migration. Because of some issues that we had, we needed to just move off of the hosting environment that we were on. So I've done a lot of this. We've moved everything. So if you have any questions during the presentation about anything that I'm going to show you, please hold on the questions and answers and put in a question. And hopefully Brian will chip in and let me know if there's one there. My free 30-day Azure Pass, if you'd like to try Azure for free for 30 days, is here on the screen, bit.ly/Robin on Azure. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about, because mostly we're going to talk about code. So I'm assuming that people who are on the call know what Azure is and maybe have looked at it or heard of it or have some idea. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the terms. This isn't really a talk about all the different kinds of things in Azure and all the details of that. Cloud computing in general is storing data and running your applications on servers hosted by others. There's infrastructure as a service. There's infrastructure as a service. Brian, I think I lost my talk there. Thank you. There's infrastructure as a service, which is kind of what Amazon has really led the way in, and it's what they really specialize in. And Microsoft offers some of that, but primarily Microsoft is responsible for platform as a service. They're a real pioneer in that. Nobody else offers that. And what that actually is it's kind of like integration with your development environment. So what we found was, since we all were C# developers and we knew Visual Studio and all of that, that migrating our stuff to Azure was really pretty simple, generally speaking. I mean, there's, little details, but we had a whole bunch of ASMX 2.0 web services that we converted to WCF. Our web applications we converted. Just the entire backend. Our database we moved to SQL Azure. So it was, since we were already very familiar with the development environment, it made it a lot easier for us to do that. So the major bits of Azure, of Windows Azure, there's SQL Azure, which is a variant of a SQL Server database. There are web roles and worker roles. And so these are like, think of them as virtual machines. And the difference between a web role and a worker role is that you run IIS in a web role. So if you need IIS, you publish using a web role, and if you don't, use a worker role. For example, a web application would run in a web role, but if you have an application that just pulls data down and processes it, that would run in a worker role. For storage in Windows Azure, there are blobs, queues, and table storage. Blobs are just files. Queues are, you can think of MSMQ, but they're not quite the same. You have to handle pulling stuff off the queues and making sure you don't pull it off twice and things like that, but it's the same general idea. And table storage, for those of you who are old enough to remember, to me they're like flat files, flat file sequential index files with single indexes. So they're just, if you want to dump tons and tons of data and read it with one key, then that's what table storage is for. I've lost my presentation again. Thank you. So let's talk about SQL Azure a little bit. SQL Azure is very, very similar to SQL Server, and how well you can migrate that depends on what you do in SQL Server. You manage it SQL Azure with SQL Server Management Studio. We migrated ours using the SQL Server Migration Wizard on CodePlex. The SQL Azure people have some things in the works to dump your database and reload it in SQL Azure. So there's quite a few tools for this sort of thing. It doesn't support Windows Integrated Security, so you have to use SQL Server Security. Access is controlled by IP address and by SQL account. So if I try to access your SQL Azure database, if you don't have my IP address in there, it won't let me access it. Most of the limitations between the two versions have to do with disk access. So you can't use CLR, you can't use user-defined functions. There's no full-text search, which I guess people are really clamoring for. A lot of people use that. So you can't do that. The database can be accessed inside or outside the cloud. You will find, as we did, that accessing it from outside the cloud might not be a great idea, which I'll talk about. The database size is limited to 50 gig. And here's the thing. You have to write retry code. The SQL Azure team talks a lot about connection management, but what that really means is exponential retry code. So they do have connection issues. When we went into production in November, I was horrified to find suddenly thousands of logging errors, thousands of errors being logged about connections being lost. And I called around a lot and finally managed to, they were like, well, have you done this? So we put in this retry code, and what it means is when you try to connect to the database or you try to execute a stored procedure, you need to check it for it to fail. If it fails, we wait 0 seconds the first time and we immediately try again. If it fails the second time, we wait 7.5 seconds, which we chose arbitrarily. If it fails that time, we wait 15 seconds and then try again. And if it fails the fourth time, we give up. But, it depends on the process. There's some things, if your customer is sitting there waiting for it, you don't want to have it, well, we'll just have it wait a minute and try again, because the customer's, going to obviously wander off. So you kind of have to pick that. We do have some cases where we have things that get updated that aren't immediately important, so we put those in a queue, and we take them off the queue, and we process them individually, separately, with longer timeout periods. So we had a lot of trouble when we first went in production. And after making kind of a stink about it at the MVP Summit, the SQL Azure team assigned somebody to me to help figure out what my problem was. After reviewing our code with the exponential retry, thank you very much, and reviewing all of our stuff, he came back and he said, you know what, it's not you, it's us. And I said, well, I just might want to break up then. But he was very nice about it, of course. And here's what happened to us. We have a small company with a lot of customers, but our application is a desktop application that's not constantly connected. The customer can be sitting there using it and not do anything that connects to the database, for an hour or 2 hours. And the first bug is in ADO.NET, which is that the connections drop after 30 minutes. They go dead. So if you connect to the database and it gives you a connection, it could be a dead connection that you get because they're not taking them out of the pool. So you call it, you connect, you think you've connected, you try to execute your query, and it fails because they haven't taken the dead connection out of the pool. That's how come our first retry is 0 seconds, because it immediately retries, and the second time it'll get a live connection. So that was one issue. And the other issue is that we have such a small database. Our database is like 3 or 4 gig. They put you on a server with all of these people that have big databases because, you kind of fit in that little niche. And all the big databases take up so much resource that they're not quite take up enough to be throttled, but if all of them take up close to the max, then it impacts our performance. So I have to say that in the months since then, they've done a lot of work on this because we hardly ever see this problem anymore. We still have to code for it, but we hardly ever see it anymore. So why would you want to use Azure? Well, it could save you a lot of money. That's a pretty good reason. You also don't have to buy and manage infrastructure to run your application. So we're an ISV, and a lot of startups, when they start up, they go out and they have to buy servers that are large enough to handle the capacity for them being totally successful. So you might pay $1 million for hardware and however much money to host it in a hosting environment. And that can be really, really expensive. With Azure, it's pay as you go. So you can start up your company, push out your application to some small instances, and when you become successful and start gathering money, you can, increase the size of your instances and or increase the number of your instances. So you might start with 2 extra small instances of your website. And then as you're more successful, you might end up with, 10 large instances or something like that. But you get to pick that, and hopefully you're earning enough money to actually pay for it. The other reason for using Azure is scalability. If you have hardware servers and you decide, okay, you're on Oprah one day. Of course, Oprah's not on the air anymore, but let's say you're on Oprah on the OWN network or whatever it is, and suddenly you have 100,000 people sign up to use your application. Now you have to go out and buy a server, hook the server into your infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it takes a long time. With Azure, you can just go in and increase the number of instances. Now, with the database, you might want to do sharding or some kind of regional storage or something like that, but I still think that that's easier to take care of than it is to buy extra servers. So it's scalability, and it's infinite, and it's fast. You also save lots of money. I know, I already said that once, didn't I? Well, so here's the deal about us. I'm not going to give you total dollar numbers, but I will say that switching to Windows Azure and SQL Azure cut our infrastructure costs by 85%. And we've just actually done a review and downsized some of our instances because we made them very large. It dropped ours by 85%, and we went from having like 10 servers that were the equivalent of medium instances to 20 because we made everything medium instances and rolled it over. So now we're going around making them small. So our actual cost savings at this point is probably close to 90%. So it was pretty substantial. And that is why you want to use Azure, plus the scalability. So let's show the code. Show me the code, right? I don't think that worked the way I expected it to. Just a second. There's the familiar Visual Studio. At least I hope it's familiar to you. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look. I have a database locally called CodeCam. Let's take a look. So this is my local SQL server. Let me get that moved over. So I have a database in here called CodeCam that we're going to migrate today. And it has one table and it has some stored procedures. It's not a very complicated database. I'm going to migrate this to Windows, to Azure and run it in the cloud. So what you need, what we used was the SQL Server Migration Wizard, which is on CodePlex. So if you go to CodePlex, or you could try SQL Azure. Well, that works better. So this is really key, and it was written by a guy who actually works for Microsoft. It's not technically supported, but the first thing is if you want to know if your database actually will work in the cloud, you can take this tool and just run an analysis on your database, and it will tell you what needs to be changed about it to make it work, or what's not supported, and it's free. We actually migrated our database with this. We had to shut everything down and do the migration, and it took us probably, there was one table that has like 10 million records, and that one took 2 hours, but the rest of it went really, really fast. So let's run this guy. So this is the main screen, and you can analyze it only if you want to. This will migrate from SQL Server to SQL Azure, and I think it will migrate from SQL Azure to SQL Azure, and from SQL Azure to SQL Server. Did you get that? It uses BCP, and it scripts everything out. So let's take a look. So my local one is Nightbird. So it's going to connect, and then I'm going to pick the database that I want to migrate. I'm just going to script everything, but you could be specific. You can only, sometimes what I do when developing, if I've created a whole bunch of new stored procedures locally, I'll use this to just move them up to the cloud. Okay, so now it's going to generate my SQL script. And and I have no errors. If you have any errors, it'll report them up here. And I go to the next one. It wants my SQL Server in the cloud, which is, my username is goldmillrobin at my password. I'm not going to tell you. So this is connecting to my database in the cloud. And I only have 2 databases on my server up there. We can actually create one here and call it Code Camp and pick what size we want. So I can just go, now it's going to execute my script against that server in the cloud and create my database. So it's finished. So we should be able to log onto that and look at the data. Let's see what we got here. Oops. Like I said, you can use the SQL Server Management Studio to manage your SQL Azure database. Not everything is enabled. If it's not going to let you do it, it's not enabled. In fact, I have to say there's some things that aren't enabled that I totally don't understand. For example, because I know you really want to know, if you ever write script and store procedure as, I can script this procedure as a create, but not as an alter. Which I think is weird, because you can script it as a create, and then you can change this to alter. So really, what's the difference? The other thing that I think is a little bit odd is if you do tables, we script this one. It adds things like cat index, which are not supported in SQL Azure. These row locks are not allowed in SQL Azure, page locks. So I think that's a little bit odd. But so we can actually look and see what data I have. So there we go. So this is our table we're going to work with today. It's just something silly. First name, last name, favorite movie, and favorite language. So that's the general idea on migrating SQL Azure. It's not very hard. Well, it wasn't very hard for us. If you have a lot of CLR routines, you're probably in trouble. We actually found some. There was one CLR routine and a couple of triggers that we had to take out because they were using something local. So now what I'd like to do is now that we have a database, we're going to write a WCF service to access it. We'll put in diagnostics. We'll set up configuration settings. We'll run it in a dev fabric. Then we'll create a client and we'll test that, running it in a dev fabric. So after that, we will publish it into the cloud and see if it runs. After that, we'll add a method to the WCF service to submit messages to a queue, so you know how to do queuing. Add a worker role to pull the messages off the queue, and then we'll change it to write it to blob storage. We'll update the client to call the service to do all that, and then we'll publish the service to the cloud and update the client to call it in the cloud and see it run. So let's start with a new project. And let's call it something really compelling, something really interesting. Customer services. Okay, so it wasn't really all that compelling. Azure customer services. See, doesn't just adding the word Azure make it more compelling? Okay, well maybe it's me. Did I mention I work a lot? So we're going to select the cloud project here, Windows Azure project, and I'm targeting .NET 4. So we want a WCF service role, so I'm going to select that here. And if you hover over this, you can click this tiny little pencil over here, and you can name your service role. I'm going to call mine Customer Services Web Role. So it will create your project. I have a cloud project. It's very exciting. So this is my cloud project up here, and this is my actual web role. So this is what's actually going to be placed in the cloud to run. This is how you manage the configurations. So if we look at this, this is all the settings for this role when it's run in the cloud. I'm going to run mine under full trust, 1 instance count. I could set that to 100, but I'd have to pay for it. The VM size, HTTP, you can support HTTPS endpoints, and I recommend that for your WCF services. And you can enable diagnostics. So my diagnostics right now are going to go to development storage. And you can put in configuration settings here, although frankly I do mine in XML. And here you can put in endpoints. You can name them. You can put in as many as you like. Well, actually, that's not true. I think they're limited to 2 or 3. And then this is for local storage. So we have one service that downloads something, does some manipulation to it, and then re-uploads it, and we don't care about the interim product. So after we upload it to blob storage, we delete it off of local storage. So we actually allowed like a gig of data. So this gives you a local disk that you can access. I have no certificates, and I have no virtual network. So let's look at the XML, because it's always more interesting anyway. So this is telling me my service configuration. And one of the things I always do is change this to a 2. So if you leave this as a 1, it will initiate your instances as Windows Server 2008. But if you make it 2, it'll use Windows Server 2008 R2. If you have things that are specific on the version number, you can also fill this in. So if it happens to be Windows 2008 R2, a specific version of that, you can specify that. It just depends on how you do your testing. Here's my name of my role, my instances, and I have one configuration setting. So let's go over here, and here's our interface. Let's rename our interface because I don't think iService 1 is very interesting. We'll call it iCustomer Services. Do you notice the trend here? Okay, look, you can use the rename command when we refactor it. Thank you. That's very kind of them. And I'm going to rename it here. And let's go rename this guy while we're at it. And rename it here. It's just because I can't stand to look at it. Customer Services. Please don't publish anything to production called Service 1. Okay, so now we're getting ready to set up. Let's start with the web role. Let's take a look at that. Now I want to say something about the web config here. Anything you want to put in the web config, to change it, you either have to remote desktop into the instance, or you have to republish. Now, if you remote desktop into your instance, and you change something, what will happen, the importance of that change, if you don't publish it, the importance of that change is indirectly proportional to how long it will be before Microsoft installs a patch and recycles your role. So what we found is if we put something in, we just go in and change it because we want to try something out, Microsoft will recycle that role pretty quickly. But if we put something in that we just want to try out and we assume they're going to recycle our role, they don't. So the Murphy's Law is working against you. So if you make any changes to your web config that you want to stick, you have to republish your instance. The other thing is, the best thing to do is put as many of your configuration settings as possible that you might ever want to change in your service configuration instead, because you can pull them from there. And that way, you can, when your service is actually running in the cloud, you can edit the configuration and change the value without having to republish it. So what we want to do is put diagnostics code in here. So this is the first chunk. So for a web role or a worker role, this is just a name of the connection string to diagnostics. And I didn't want to type it in over and over again. So this pulls a reference to the storage account, and this pulls a reference to the diagnostics manager for that storage account. And this sets up the default configuration. So after that, we can do all of our configuration and then save it at the end. For a worker role, you can do a get current configuration, but that won't work for a web role. I think it's because the web role runs in a different app domain than the application itself. These are the polling intervals for how often I want to check to see if there's diagnostics. Because what it does is it's going to write the trace diagnostics and then move them to Windows storage. So how often do you want that to happen? So this is for the logs is for how often to move the logs, and this is for how often to move the IIS logs. If you want to see your IIS logs and your failed request logs and things like that, you need to do that. And then this is for performance monitoring. So I'm going to add a bit of code here. I want to track the performance counters on the % CPU on my application. Because if I do that and then I check and I find out it's using like 70 or 80% all the time, I know I need to scale up. And I believe you could put any performance counters in here that you can do in regular Windows Server. And then I'm going to put in the Windows event log handling. So this will actually write Windows event logs to table storage so I can see them without logging into the computer. The other thing is, aside from just logging into the computer, if your role gets recycled, you lose everything that's actually on the VM. So this maintains it in table storage in case that happens. And then this just sets that to be my current configuration. So that sets up my diagnostics. The other thing I want to do is what if I go in and I do change my diagnostics? What if I go in and edit the config while my application is running in the cloud? I want it to do something. So I'm going to take a catch-all here. And what I'm going to do is if there's any change at all in the configuration settings, restart my role. So you can actually fine-tune this code. I could fine-tune this code to say, well, if it's a connection string to the database, and if it's something I'm loading into memory, just reload it into memory. Or if it's this setting, then reboot it. But if it's this setting, just do this. So you can fine-tune this to do whatever it is that you want to. I'm just taking a, just recycle the dang thing. I'll figure it out later sort of attitude here. So in the performance monitoring, you'll notice I'm getting configuration. This code right here pulls the configuration setting from the service configuration. So I didn't want to hard code these values because this is how often it samples, and this is how often it transfers that information to table storage. So, if the thing is pretty dead and it's running at 0%, or 1% or 5%, I don't really need to see that every minute of every day. And so I might set the sample rate to every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, something like that. Whereas if I'm seeing like a lot of traffic in parts of the day and not in other parts of the day, I can do performance monitoring on that and check and see what my trends are. And at that point, I might want to have it every minute. Or if I just like to write a lot of stuff to table storage, because it will write a lot of stuff to table storage. So let's add these to the configuration file. So this has, let's look at what this is. This is the connection string to diagnostics. This is the connection string to my local database. And notice, even though I have Windows, I can connect to it locally when I'm running SQL Server Management Studio. From Azure, I have to give it a user ID and a password. So here's my performance monitoring counters here. So I'm going to sample it every 60 seconds, and transfer the counters every 2 minutes. These two fields here, I talked about the SQL Azure and the retry stuff. So these two fields, we've put in here so that we can change them depending on what's going on. So we have some applications that, like I said, pull stuff off of a queue and then write it to the database. And so for those, we might want to have it try. So this is the number of times it will try to execute the commands before it gives up. So if it tries to connect and it fails, or it tries to execute a store procedure, it will retry. It'll only retry 3 times, and it'll stop at the 4th try. And this is what I call the sleep interval. So I have set mine to 0, and then intervals of this. So if my try count is 4, then it retries at 0, 2500 to 5700 milliseconds. So for some roles, we set this higher because we will give it a chance to try harder. So, oops. So the other thing is, if you add it to the service configuration, you have to add it to the service definition. So, and this is how it knows what fields to show you when you actually want to modify your configuration online. So this tells Azure, these are the things that I'm tracking. These are the things that I'm accessing. So the other thing that we use is we use a class called global. We create a class called global static properties. I know somebody out there is going to hate this, but make me an offer. Global static on a better idea. So for us, what global static properties are, sometimes we'll load configuration information in here. That's pretty much what we use it for. I don't want, like on the retry counts and stuff like that, I don't want to retrieve that off of disk repeatedly and convert it to integer. Convert it to integer, convert it to integer, convert it to integer, convert it to integer. Let's convert it to integer. That, it's just like enough already. So most of our global static properties are things that we convert to integer. So we're obviously going to need 2 for these 2, or not for these 2. Oh, for the diagnostics. So for the SQL settings. So let's do, oops. Ta-da. So I'm going to put one in. I'm going to put one in for the connection string. And I'm going to put one in for the max try count, which we saw, and one in for the retry sleep time. So all this does is it checks to see, has it been loaded yet? And if it hasn't been loaded yet, it pulls it out of the configuration, converts it to integer, and so it'll only do that the first time, and after that it'll just return it. This is my stuff that sets up my sleep times. It actually sets up an array, a list, a generic list of sleep times. So it just cycles through there and adds in the intervals, and that's how it gets 0, 2500, 5000, 7500, and whatever. So those are my global static properties so far. So now let's actually set up our service. So I'm going to go to our interface. I always like to set up the supporting stuff first. So this is what our interface is going to look like. We're going to offer the opportunity to pull the list of favorites out of the customers table for a specific customer. It'll return the movie and language. Update the favorites by name. Get a customer list and add a customer. So what we generally do is add a class for each thing that we want to accomplish. So I'm going to add a class here. We're going to call it customer favorites, if we can spell it right. Okay. So I need some using clauses here, and here's the code. So my service is going to call get customer favorites, get this. The first thing I always do is do a trace to let me know it's called. We have a lot of tracing in our application, and you can set that back to just show the errors if you like. But we're using informational tracing. When we put it in, we just really wanted to be sure everything was working right. So this is my initial try count. This is the counter on the loop for trying the SQL Azure calls. And this is whether it succeeded or not. So I have one big giant try-catch statement around it. Now, I have to say this about the retry code. I had already rolled this in like, I don't know, 40 different procedures before I found out that the App Fabric team actually has guidance on this. So they have a class or set of classes that actually does extension methods for the SQL connections and all of the SQL commands. And you can use that if you like. We didn't want to go back and change all of ours. The other thing is there's two things that one doesn't do that I would want to modify it for, and I just have never gotten around to it. One thing is there's something called the context ID. When we were having a lot of problems with ours, they asked me to retrieve and log the context ID, and it's a call from SQL Azure to do that. And it's a GUID that identifies the connection. And if you give them that, Microsoft can trace and find everything that was done with that connection and find out exactly what the issue was. And so that provided a lot of clarification. But we didn't want to, you don't want to put that in every single routine because it will impact your performance. So we had a handful, out of all of the things that access the database, we had a handful of things that specifically failed a lot. And so we put it in those. So that's one thing I would change about the App Fabric thing is to allow you to specify whether or not to put out the context ID. And I also have the ability to log something. But let's look at this, because I haven't had time to fix all of them. You know how it is in a startup. You always have time to write it, but you don't have time to rewrite it. So this is my do loop. This is going to run until the try count hits the max, or it's successful. So here's my try. It's going to increment the try count. This is my try catch. It's around my SQL stuff. So on the outside one, on the outer try catch, this is what I call an overall exception. This means I had a problem and it was not a SQL problem. And I don't want it to, if it's having a problem because I'm trying to convert some field from the database to integer and it's null, I don't want it to crash. I don't want it to retry accessing SQL Azure 4 times. I just want it to crash out. So that's how come the try catches are in the right, are in these specific spaces. So this is a try. The other thing they recommend is to use using clauses everywhere. So whether it's a data reader or a SQL command, whatever it is, if you're going to close it, you're going to need a using clause. That's one thing that they really pinged me about. I think my data readers did closes, and they were like, no, change them all to using clauses. And if you're trying to get Microsoft to help you, it's best to follow all of their advice. Works for us. Okay, so this is my store procedure. This is my parameter. You know, this is pretty much standard ADO.NET code. So after it fills my data table, this is the call to the database. It sets success to true. So at this point, I know the SQL Azure thing worked. Whether I have any errors in my after processing code, that's a whole separate issue. So it drops through. So this, we use this format for all of our stuff. And you can choose whatever works for you. So we also need classes for all these other things. So that was customer favorites. So let's add the other ones. Which are conveniently here in this upper directory. So these are classes to add favorites, update favorites, and get a customer list. And these look exactly the same. You call into it, it traces what got called. The same retry code, the same logging. So that's the other thing. When we have an exception, we're tracing what it is. So if for Goldmail, if we have a specific, Goldmail ID or something, we'll put it in the tracing. So we were able to find that maybe some customers might have some problem other than others, although it wasn't the case. But it does let you call them and apologize if you notice that one customer is really trying a lot and not working. Customer service is always important. So that's all of these classes look pretty much the same. You could probably objectify that more if you wanted to. So now that we have the classes and we have all of the code in here, we need to actually put it in the service because we haven't actually implemented it yet. So let's put some code in here. So this is just, these are going to be exposed to public. So the other thing I would recommend is making these internal. I tend to be a little paranoid. These are internal, so because you don't need to access these outside your service. They're only going to be accessed from inside. So these are what's going to be accessed when I expose the service to the public, get favorites, update favorites by name. So I always return an error message. If it's blank, it's fine. And so these are just standard calls. Just using clause. Okay. The other thing you need is an attribute. If you don't put this in, you'll find that you can't connect your service from anywhere except maybe inside Windows Azure, which sort of defeats the purpose of it. This basically says, let me access my WCF service from anywhere. At this point, this should build. Or not. There you go. Now we can run it in Development Fabric. So running things in the Development Fabric is free. Now this is a 32-bit machine, but it'll work anyway. I'm going to lower this a little bit. No, we can't. So this is starting up. And what I will show you, I'll have to clip it and show you, because it won't. It's not. So this is started up my window, and I can put in here customer services.svc. And here's my service, the front of my service, and I can look at the whistle. You will want to hide that when you actually publish it to production, which you can do in your web config file right here. If you set this to false, your whistle won't be displayed anymore. You can't access it from outside. You can still call it, but you can't create a service reference. And I strongly, strongly recommend that you tie that down. So let's see. So here's our whistle. The other thing is you'll see a little Azure logo in your tool, in your system tray, and you can see my service running. Whoops. Well, I hope I can see my service running, right? Come on. Buggers. There we go. I hope you can see that. So these are the details about my service. So however many you have running, it will show in here. So here's my customer services, and here's my IP address for it. If you publish it a bunch of times, it may increment this to 82, 83, 84. And this is the easiest way to find out what the heck it is, especially if you're not starting up the HTTP page. And I can look at my role, see what's going on. So it's called run, it's running. So that's pretty cool, but what do we do with it now? Well, now we should probably create a service, a client application rather. Oops, not that one. So let's look at what's in this client application. This has a main form. This is just kind of a shell. There's no data in here. This is what my form looks like. So I created this for the sole purpose of testing my service. So it'll show these, and you can get the customer list, and you can fill in a first name and last name and get the favorites. So this will call the service. So, oops, that's running. So all of my data access is in this class called the DAC, and there isn't any. So first we need to add a service reference. So we right-click on here and choose Add Service Reference, and put in our service, which I'm going to get from here. Tell it to go find the information about my services. I'm going to call it Customer SVC. You can actually look at it here and see what it's exposing. So here's my 4 methods. So that's pretty cool. So one of the things that we do is we actually set the IP, or in a client application, we set the endpoint address in a configuration file. So the first thing we always do when we add a new service to a client application is we add a method that basically pulls an instance of the client and sets the endpoint address to what it is in the config file. I've hard-coded it here, but in the real world it would be in a config file. And this allows us to flip back and forth to run the same client against staging and production. So if you haven't changed anything about the signature of the service, and all you've changed is what it does, or added more logging or something you want to test with it, we can just change our app config file and run this. So let's put in the rest of our code. So this is just the data access class, and we actually found our desktop application, we had a DAC class in there, and all the data access, all the access to the web services we had at that time were in that one place. So to convert that so that application would run in Azure, we only had to change that one class. All of the other code was fine. It's just that one class. So a little forethought helped save us a lot of trouble. So this basically, here's our method for getting the favorites for customer. And here's updating favorites by name. These are pretty standard vanilla C# code. So it just creates the client and then calls it and passes in the fields. So the other thing that's cool about running it in the development fabric is you can put in breakpoints. So there's zero service. And then you can trace it through. So let's put one here. So we put breakpoints in. Let's just try it. We'll go back to our client. Let's run the client. See if it builds. So that's a good sign when it builds. Doesn't mean it'll work, but at least it compiles. Okay, so I'm going to get my customer list. So I can see here, this is my actual WCF service running, and I can trace through it. It's going to call my class to get my list. Here's the tracing. So if you're having a problem somewhere in your code, this is really, really nice. I will say that if it runs in the development fabric, it will probably run in the cloud, but it's not a given. There is a difference. There are some differences there. So let's add a new user. Let's add Brian Madsen, Crocodile Dundee. I know that's his favorite movie. What do you think his favorite language is? Let's see. PowerShell. And we'll add him. So this will call the add routine. So and you can hover over these. You can just anything you can do with regular code, you can sit here and do this with your cloud projects. We'll take these out, see if it works. And we'll pull the customer list again. This is not a fancy client application. So here he is. So we can also change it. Oh, he actually liked the second one better. And it updates it. There's no delete here. I didn't add delete. So that's working. Our client is working. So maybe what we should do is publish this to the cloud and see how to do that. But you can't do while turning. So one thing about publishing it to the cloud, if you publish something to the cloud and it sits there and it does initializing, and it just like takes forever and it never ever boots, the first thing you should check is to make sure that your connection string is actually not use development storage equals true, because that will so not work. You have to actually put in a real connection string. So here's mine. So I'm going to comment these out. And you can actually run it in the development fabric against production if you want to. It's just not as performant. Okay, so this points at my staging database, and it points at my production or my staging diagnostics. So if I want to publish this now, I can right-click on my cloud project and do publish. Now I will say that I'm using Tools 1. I have not upgraded my Tools version on this machine yet. So the new one will let you actually set up multiple configuration files. So let's publish this guy. Waiting for the deployment environment to load. There we go. These are all of my hosted services. So let's publish it to Goldmail Robin 2 to the production instance. So this is my production, and this is the staging instance of the same service. And we'll use my Goldmail storage account. Prompt it before deleting. It's going to call it Azure Customer Services. Let's call it version 1.0.0.0. And you can actually configure remote desktop so that I can RDP into it. I'm going to pick this SSL certificate. And an expiration date. And we're going to publish it. So the deal about publishing, it prepares the package, it connects up there, it uploads it, and then it's going to unfurl it into a virtual machine for you. If you have a whole bunch of builds to do, we have a lot of services, and our releases tend to be pretty complicated. The next one is going to impact 8 different services. So you can sit there and publish each one and wait for it. But you can also sit here and publish this and wait until it gets past uploading and it starts creating. At that point, you can open a different project and go publish that one. So you can have a whole bunch of them publishing simultaneously. As long as it's finished uploading, you don't screw with it. So we're actually going to publish this, and then we're going to go make changes to it while it's publishing. Because the deal is, so it takes, I live in California, so if you're publishing it between midnight and 3 a.m., I'd say, it takes, the fastest I've ever seen anything published was 7 minutes. I hardly had time to make coffee. So that was really, really speedy. But usually during the day, it takes 15 to 20 minutes. And if you have something that is really hard to upload, like our website is quite large, so it takes 10 minutes to upload the dang thing, then that takes a half an hour because we have to include the uploading time. So this is uploaded, and now it is creating. It's uploaded to our blob storage somewhere, and it's now creating. It's to our storage account. It's creating the VM. And I know you're worried that we're actually going to sit here and watch this for 20 minutes. I promise you I won't make you do that. Although you could go get coffee. And 20 minutes seems like a long time, 15 or 20 minutes. I think I'm hoping they're going to improve that this year still. But if it makes you feel any better, it used to take an hour. which was good because you had time to go to lunch. Oh yes, I'm publishing my Azure instances from the Taco Bell on the corner. And now you can't really do that unless you eat really, really fast, or you get it for carry-out. So this is starting up. And here we go. It's initializing instance 0. So however many instances you see, it'll start them all up. So while it's doing that, we should probably go look, just for grins, at the diagnostics in our development storage since we set it up. What was that? You see that? Okay. This is the Azure Diagnostics Manager for Sarah Brada. It's not free, but it's very cool. So we actually paid for software. It's a miracle. This will let you access your development account or any of your production accounts. And what's cool about it, yes, thank you. What's cool about it, if you have a bunch of hosted services, so I'll show you. This is my favorite. This is actually why we bought the tool. If you have a lot of hosted services, oops, you can connect via your hosted services. Watch this. This is very cool. These are all of our hosted services in Goldmill. And you can look at just the diagnostics for that one service. All the diagnostics go into one table, unless you create a lot of storage accounts. So this will let me view the diagnostics for just this service, or just my infrastructure logs, just for that service, my AIS logs, my field request logs, so pull the current leak. So I don't get anything out of plugging this. I just, it was such a godsend for us, I'm sure, on our diagnostic stuff. So let's take a look at, should have done that. Okay, these are all my IIS logs for a week, for example. Let's see if it'll let me look at one. Oh, fine. Oh, I don't have that kind of patience. Okay. You get the general idea. So this is my dev account, my local dev fabric, and I can look at our tracing logs in the last hour, or the last 2 hours, or whatever. So that's pretty cool. I can just ask it for everything. Oh, no testing. We're obviously not running it enough. Okay. We'll come back to that. It takes a while for it to transfer the stuff to storage, and it caches it. So if you only have like 3 statements, it's going to take a while for it to run. So let's go ahead. Where's our client? And go to the next thing. Let's add some queuing to this guy, and let's add a worker role to process the queue. So we're going to add a queue. We're going to add the ability to queue a request, and then we're going to write from it. We're going to pull the stuff off the queue and do something with it. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is add a queue name to our configuration. You can hard code your queue names if you like, but if you ever have to change them, you have to republish. Also, it lets you tell the difference between staging and production. So you can use the same service for staging or production just by changing the queue name and configuration. So let's add a queue name. So that was hard. And we need to take this and add a service definition, but without the value. So the other thing I'm going to do is put in global static properties. So I don't have, because I'm going to use this a lot, I don't want to have to keep pulling it. So what you want to do with your queue is in your service. So we have some services that have, a lot of different methods in them, and maybe 2 methods actually use the queue. So in those cases, we have a startup for the queue to initialize it, only in those two methods. And what it'll do is whoever it hits first will start it up. First, we're going to need some code. Whoops. These are using clauses, which go up here. And then we're going to need some private variables here. So this is my actual queue. This is my storage account, my reference to my storage account for my queues. This object right here I just used to lock so that when it starts up and initializes the storage, if I have two things hit it at once, only one of them can actually try to start it up. And this Boolean tells if my storage was initialized. I don't want to start the queue repeatedly, and I don't want to check for it repeatedly. I only want to do it once. So this is my routine to initialize the storage. Checks to see if it's already been initialized, exits. If it hasn't, it locks that locking object. After it manages to lock it, it checks it again. That way, if one guy has it locked, somebody else comes in, he waits for the lock to be released, and then he finds the storage has already been initialized. So again, we're big on the tracing. And here it gets a reference to the storage account. It creates the Cloud Queue client. It gets a reference to my queue. There's my queue name. And it creates if it doesn't exist. And you always want to be sure you create it if it doesn't exist, because it will crash a Rooney's. And then at the end of this, it'll set my storage initialized to true if it actually succeeded all the way through. So now we have a queue, and we want to have a method that actually submits to the queue. So we're going to add this. Ordinarily, I'd put this in a separate class, but we're just going to stick it in here. So when I call it from the client, I'm going to give it the first name and last name. This is going to initialize the storage. It just checks to see if it's already initialized. This is going to call get favorites to get the movie and language for that person. And if that's successful, it's basically going to create a message. And a message is just a string. I use comma delimited, just a string of comma delimited entries. You can use whatever you like. And then I can instantiate a message and add it to the queue. And that's all it takes to create a message and add it to the queue. So one of our developers was looking around at, when we were doing evaluations, we looked at Amazon. And the amount of code it took to write just like an entry to what their version of blob storage was just like a whole page full of code. But in Azure, because what Microsoft is really good at is programming frameworks. They're really good at frameworks. And so with .NET is one thing. Just think about when you just write to a file, you don't have to handle all the operating system stuff. The framework handles it for you. And same thing with Azure. To do all the things that are necessary to actually write something to a queue running in the cloud, all you have to do is instantiate the message and write it. So an error. So this is going to submit it to the queue. So we also have to add it to the interface, don't we? Come on, the interface. Oops. So we add it to our interface so we make it available. Okay, so let's see if that builds. The other thing I'll tell you is that you can add to the queue from any service. So the queue is just something in storage. So you can have, I can write to the queue from this service. I could actually have a whole separate solution for a whole different project that pulls those entries off the queue and processes them. The queue is something that you can see. It's like just like storing it in a table somewhere. The other thing about that is when you publish something to production and it has a worker role pulling entries off a queue, when you publish, so when we actually put something in production, we publish to the staging instance of the production service, and then we do a VIP swap. So one day we did this, and we did a VIP swap, and we're seeing all these errors in the diagnostics, and we had changed the structure of the queue message, and it was failing. And it took us a little bit of time to figure out the reason it was failing was because what was now the staging instance that used to be production was actually, because it's still running, because we did a VIP swap, is still pulling entries off the queue and trying to process them. So after we VIP swapped it, we had to actually stop what was old production instance to make sure it didn't pull stuff off the queue. So we usually publish and then swap production and staging and then leave it there for a couple hours until we can make sure everything is okay. So in this case, that was sort of entertaining. So now we have this, which we'll submit to the queue. Let's write a worker role that will pull the entries off the queue. And we can right-click on roles, do add, new worker role project. Let's call it customer worker. That's really original. So here's our worker role. Worker role is basically an infinite loop, which goes against everything we've ever been taught in programming. So just like a web role, we want to put in diagnostics, performance monitoring, add some configurations for the queue information. So let's start with the configurations. Let's see. Configurations. So if you go back to, you're wondering where the configuration is. It's in here. Now if you look in here, it has a new role, which is called customer server. Okay, that was entertaining. We'll just roll with it. Okay. Okay. So we have a new role called customer worker. And this adds the diagnostic stuff here as well. I mean the RDP settings, because I have them in the other role. So let's put in our XML snippets. It's going to be, so we need the performance monitoring stuff, and we need the queue name. And we'll have to go add those to the CS definition file. Whoops. So I have those here as well. So they have to be in both places. I'll talk about this visibility thing in a minute. So we're going to need global static properties again. And we're going to need that for the queue name and for the visibility. So one for the queue name and one for the visibility time, which is numeric. Okay, so we have our global static properties. Now we can put in the diagnostic stuff, which looks very much like the other diagnostics. The only difference is this one right here, which we can call it to get convert current configuration instead of reinitializing it. Okay. So put in our diagnostics. And we put in our role environment. not changing. So there we go. So that starts up all our diagnostics. So we're going to need to set up our queue in here, because this is our worker role. Cloud queue, queue. Going to give it a very hard to remember name. We're going to call it Q. Not to be confused with the guy in the James Bond movies. Ha ha ha. Okay. So the other thing we need is something to actually start up our queue when our worker role starts up. Let's see. So this will start up our queue. Basically pulls a reference to the storage account, creates the cloud queue client, and sets up the queue name. And this gets a reference. So this actually gets a reference to the queue. So when we write stuff or read stuff in the queue, it's here. So again, this checks to see if the storage is initialized, and it creates a queue if it doesn't exist. So this is very similar to the other one. Think of it as kind of a race condition. You want to be sure that your queue gets created before you check it for messages, and you want to be sure it's created before you add messages to it. So in Run here, we're going to start up our queue. And now we need to do something about this loop. So we're going to loop, but we're not going to just have it sleep, because that's not really going to be helpful to us. So let's take this out. We'll add the running code. So what this does is if the queue exists, this will check the visibility. So I talked about the visibility, and here's the thing. This isn't like MSMQ where you can take it off the queue and it's actually gone. You actually take it off the queue, and then you have to delete the message from the queue. When you take it off the queue, it makes it invisible for a certain amount of time. And if it doesn't finish processing and you haven't deleted it from the queue, it puts it back on. The point of that is if your process fails and it doesn't finish processing that entry from the queue, when your service comes back up, it'll still be there because it's in storage, it is persisted, and it'll try to process it again later. So you need to be sure you know that and be sure you account for that. So if you're doing partials of something, you need to be sure to check for that. So if you're copying from A to B and then doing this and doing that, you need to check to make sure which steps might have happened. This line of code right here gets the message off the queue and sets the visibility timeout. We actually have a process that takes about 1.5 to 2 minutes to run. So this is how I found out about this, is that it downloads a bunch of stuff and does some stuff with it. Processes these images and puts them out in blob storage. And we were having these errors from stuff being written over and blah, blah, blah. And I noticed that in our diagnostics tracing, see, it's always good to have diagnostics tracing, that it was being processed multiple times. So I tested it and it looked fine to me. Looks fine to me. But it was still being processed twice. And that's when I found out that I think the default visibility is like 30 seconds. Might even be lower than that. And it was actually, the first one would pull it off the queue, and because it took 1.5 to 2 minutes to process it, it would come back and be visible in the queue, and the second instance of the worker role would pick it up and process it. So to handle that, we processed, tons and tons and tons of them, and checked on how much time it actually took. And we found that none of them took more than 2 minutes. So just to be on the safe side, we set the visibility timeout to 3 minutes. And after that, we never had the problem with it double processing again. The other thing you can do is you can, we could have written to a table that was processing, but you still have that, and then have it check the table to see if it's processing before it does it. But A, I don't really want to add any more load to my database for something like that. And B, I don't want to add more load to my database. And they could actually both do it at the same time, so I'd still have the same darn problem. So just set your timeout to visibility, to what you think it's actually going to take to process your deals. This line of code right here pulls a message off the queue, and it applies that timeout when it pulls a message off of the queue, not when it puts it on the queue. So if it finds a message, it's going to trace it, and that's going to process it. So what we do is we just do a split on it because it's comment limited. And our first one is always a command that tells what it's supposed to do. We have some queues that actually process multiple commands. So if it's process, it's going to pull off the 4 fields, and it's going to call process queue entry to process it, which we don't have yet. After it processes the entry, it's going to delete the message from the queue. Now I have a link here to Steve Marks' blog. If you haven't checked out Steve Marks' blog and you're doing Azure, you should go check it out. He has some really helpful stuff in there. So if it fails deleting it, which could happen, and it's not, so maybe it's already been deleted by somebody else or something, so it throws the error if it's not a message not found. So if there's some other reason it has for deleting it, I want to know about it. And after it does all the processing, I'm just sweeping the thread for 5 seconds before checking for the next one. And if there's an overall exception thrown, it does the same thing. So let's add our class for processing the queue. Which there happens to conveniently be one here in the top folder. Wow. Wasn't that handy? So let's take a look at that. So all this is going to do right now is take those 4 fields and write them to diagnostics. So it's just going to trace them. Uh-oh. Okay. Always better when it tells. So let's run this. I know you're wondering if the other one ever finished, so let's take a look. Look at that, it finished. Let's see how long it took. 11:03 basically. Hey, that's 8 minutes. That's really good. Must be sainted. Okay, so I actually have one running. Let's go take a look at it. You can go to your portal. That's not what I want to do. Windows.azure.com. Your portal is your friend. It's in Silverlight. This was my first clue. Come on, you can do it. Okay. So I can see a list of my hosted services in my portal. This is the portal for my account. I can look at my production deployments. So here's one I published yesterday, and here's the one I published today. Well, not yesterday. I published it at 3 o'clock this morning, 1:30. And here's the one I just published. So you can actually, from here in your portal, you can delete these. You can, if you have a staging instance, you can swap them, swap staging and production. You can reboot it. You can connect to it. So that's RDP, because I enabled RDP. So we can see ours running. So let's do this. Let's go back to our client, a test service. And let's set this to robin2.goldmill.com and see if it works. Dun, dun, dun. I hope it works. I know, the suspense is killing me. Come on, you can do it. Dang, so it didn't work. We have to look into trace diagnostics. That's a bummer. To figure out what I did wrong. Let's see. Diagnostics. Connect to my account. This is why you put in diagnostics, by the way. So when it doesn't work, you can find out why. Although it might take a little bit of time for it to totally flush to diagnostics. Come on. No diagnostics. It's grim all the way around. Okay, we'll come back to that. It'll finish in a bit. Okay, so we're running this guy locally. Let's go to our client here, and let's point him back at our local endpoint. Is it still 81? It's still 81. Let's see. Okay, so this should now have an add queue method in it. So let's update our reference here. Okay, and now if we go, so now we want to add a method to actually, that can be called from our main screen to submit it to the queue. And you can see that this is now in my service here. And I have the new, just by refreshing my reference, I pick up a new one. So let's go to our main form and make sure we have that connected. Let's see, queue. Let's look for queue. Because it's magically already there. So let's just check. I want to check my service. Okay. I'll just check and make sure it's writing to the right place. So let's run it. So I get my customer list. So now I can add myself, Robin.net. I can just click this and it'll add it to the queue. And the worker role should pull it off the queue and process it. We'll add Sarah. And we'll add Beth. I'm sure Beth would appreciate being immortalized in my Azure presentation. We'll add Brian. I hope I spelled your name right, Brian. Okay, so this is basically queuing them up. It should be writing them to storage. Let's go see if we can see it. Okay, let's disconnect this. The last hour. Okay. So we can see our diagnostics here. So this is where I always put the method name in square brackets because I can't tell what the heck's going on. So this way I can easily look up my diagnostics and see what's being called. So here's a submit to queue. Here's the message passed to the queue. Process Robin.net is Star Trek too obvious. Okay, customer favorites was called. So here, it submitted it to the queue. Here's the one for Sarah. It pulled the customer favorites for hers. So here's the method where it's submitting them all to the queue. Although I don't see the ones where it's processing them. Let's see. Here's your customer favorites. That you. I guess we should check to see if it's actually working. And how would we do that? I guess we would put something in our worker role. wouldn't we? So let's go down to our worker role. To here. And let's queue another one. Whoop. And let's take a look at our cloud storage. And element storage. You can look at your queues to see what's in them. And there is one, but it's hidden, so it's big pulled. So it has a visibility thing set. So let's see. Messages, no. So I have a message. I can see my message here. Here's Brian and his PowerShell. Processing it, traces it, writes it out. So you can see it processing it. I suppose it'll show up in diagnostics eventually. Okay. So that's pretty annoying. Let's change it to write to blob storage. So diagnostics. Let's see. Here it is. So here we're seeing it being pulled off the queue. For command process, here's the first name. So here's the tracing. Okay, that makes me feel better. But, you know, it's sort of boring. Let's have it actually write it out to blob storage, because we all want to know how to write to blob storage, don't we? So let's stop our service. And let's change our worker role. Let's add a cloud blob container up here. A container is just a folder, but I guess they couldn't really call it a folder because it wouldn't be interesting enough. And under the role environment changing event, at the bottom, we're going to add some code here to pull the, oh, not that code, AZW3, okay. So this is basically going to pick the container up. It creates a client to the blob storage and gets a container reference to code camp. Now, if that container doesn't exist, it's going to create it. The other thing I'm doing here is I'm setting the permissions on that container so that this is called public blob access. So the container is private, but the blobs inside are to public. This means that somebody outside can't get a reference to that container and enumerate through the blobs that are in there. They can only access the specific blob that they have access, that they have a URL for. So that's what that does. So when it creates a folder, it does that the first time. So let's do this, and then in our process queue, so this is going to give me basically a reference to the container, or the folder, if you want to call it a folder. They unlock you, but you can call it a folder. So let's add the container here, because if we're going to write to it, we need to know what folder to write to it. Let's go to process queue entry. Cloud blob container. Let's add some code here. So this is going to format a message. It's going to create a file name, and all it's going to do is get a reference. So this gives a reference to where it's going to write it to, and then it writes it. So you can upload text, you can upload a whole file. It's very simple to write to blob storage. So let's see if this works. Okay, so let's run this. Let's go back to our client. Now, we didn't change anything in the definition, so we don't actually have to update our reference. We should be able to just run this and it should work. Famous last words. Let's check our development storage. See how we're doing up here. Compute emulator. Where'd it go? Let's see. Here's my worker role. Stop that. Here's my worker role. Looks like he's running. And here's my web role. Storage initialized, leaving storage init routine, setting the queue message visibility time. So you can actually see your trace logging in these in the compute emulator as well. Okay, so I'm up and running, and let's pull our customer list. Actually, no, we should probably update. Let's see. Oh, so now we're still tracing down here. We can update that and we can add to the queue again. We can add me to the queue. You can see it processing it as I add them. So add me to the queue. We'll add Lassie the Wonder Dog to the queue. There we go. We can actually trace through this code here and see it right to block storage. There you go. By the way, if you write this, be sure to put some try-catch exception handling in there. You don't want your service ever to crash, so you never want to have unhandled exceptions. So this is bad example code. Bad code. Bad code. You should always put that in, because we actually had a case where we didn't put it in one place, and that was the one place that had a problem! And it did crash OLA on us. Crashed the service in Azure, it just sat there. So they recycle it for us. Very nice of Microsoft. So let's go look in here and see if we can see it. Look, here's our container. Ooh. Ah. This one is pretty recent, right? Lassie the Wonder Dog. So here it is, just right into blob storage. So that's pretty cool. So I published this. I did this last night, and I published it out to run in Azure. So let's take a look at this guy. Well, let's run it against Azure and see what it does. Dang. Diagnostics. Okay, let's check it. Trace logs for the last hour. Oops. Well, that would explain why it doesn't work. And look, you can see my retry code. Yes, I did this on purpose, so you can see the retry code. So apparently my SQL Azure does not have the store procedure. So let's fix that. That explains a lot. can. What was the error? Ooh. Well, it looks like there's one there across customer list. I appear to be having a SQL Azure problem today. Wow. How rude. Okay, well that explains that. Although I don't know why. I'll have to trace it through SQL Azure to see why it can't find it. Unless it's pointing to the wrong database. Let's do this. Let's look at our configuration. So this is Goldmail Robin. Let's edit this guy right here. We can edit the configuration on him. Somebody got their connection string wrong. You can actually edit this configuration in place. And eventually this role will recycle. Whoops, and it'll work. So now you know how to edit a configuration string, a configuration in place, and it'll take it a few minutes to come by. So that's pretty much the gist of the talk, and how to get your services to run and how to convert everything. So we talked about WCF services, SQL Azure, how to access SQL Azure, how to write retry code, writing a service or writing a test client that will actually call your service, submitting information to a queue, messages, pulling the messages off the queue in a worker role, and writing them to blob storage. So while this is updating, does anybody have any questions? Let's see. We have a question.
Hi, Robin. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. My name's Anthony, by the way, and I actually was wondering, did you guys ever look into using multi-tenancy with your SQL Azure instance?
We haven't had to do that. We have customers all around the globe,
Right.
but we've only got we have like 5,000 or 6,000 customers.
Okay.
So we haven't had any kind of performance issues in terms of that. It will not help the connection issues.
Right. No. It's not necessarily from a connection, but more from a financial aspect. I mean, having multiple instances of SQL Azure for just small data, small clients to say.
Well, the
And
thing is
so-
you have to pay for it. So our database is like 3 gig.
Mhm.
And the other thing I should share is we're a BizSpark customer. So we get an MSDN. MSDN, if you're BizSpark, you get, which is their, startup, their,
Yep.
their startups. If you get that, you get like 3 small databases for free.
Okay.
So, for us, if we had needed 50 gig databases, then that's actually not a bad idea because those are, I think they're like $400 a month or something. I could be totally wrong on that, but it seems to me, I'm a cheapskate, so I like to spend as little as I possibly can of my money and my company's money.
Sure.
And that's an interesting thought. If you had a bunch of 10 gig databases instead of 50, it just depends on how you can parse your data out. They do have this new stuff coming. I hope this
Yeah,
is,
this SQL Azure Federations or something.
yeah, okay, thank you. I was hoping that wasn't NDA. That I saw a demo of, I saw the guy in the SQL Azure team talk about it. It was really, really cool where they're actually handling some of that for you and how you can do the code.
Right,
Stuff like
yeah.
that.
I've
So,
seen it,
yeah.
but I haven't seen anywhere I could